Hello, my brothers and sisters. This is Sister Mary, and we're going to continue in the second book now of Maccabees. This will be chapter 1 through chapter 5. The first letter to their brothers, the Jews living in Egypt. From their brothers, the Jews in Jerusalem and Judea, greetings and untroubled peace. May God prosper you, remembering his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his faithful servants. May he give you all a heart to worship him and to do his will with a generous mind and a willing spirit. May he open your hearts to his law and his precepts and give you peace. May he hear your prayers and be reconciled with you and not abandon you in time of evil. Such is our prayer for you. During the reign of Demetrius, in the year 169, we Jews wrote to you as follows. In the extremity of trouble that befell us in the years after Jason and his associates had betrayed the Holy Land, and the kingdom, burning down the temple gateway, and shedding innocent blood, we prayed to the Lord, and were then heard. And we then offered a sacrifice with wheat flour. We lit the lamps, and we set out the loaves. As we now recommend you to keep to the Feast of Shelters in the month of Chislev, in the year 188. Second letter. This is an address. The people of Jerusalem and of Judea, the Senate and Judas, to Aristobulus, tutor to King Ptolemy, and one of the family of the anointed priest, and to the Jews in Egypt, greetings and good health. Since we have been rescued by God from great danger, we give him great thanks for championing our cause against the king. For he it was who carried off those who had taken up arms against the holy city. For when their leader reached Persia with his seemingly irresistible army, he was cut to pieces in the temple of Nenania as the result of a ruse employed by the priest who served that goddess. On the pretext of marrying Nenania, Antiochus came to the place with his friends, intending to take its many treasures as a dowry. The priest of Nenania had put these on display, and he, for his part, had entered the temple precincts with only a small retinue. As soon as Antiochus had gone inside the temple, the priest shut him in, opened a trap door hidden in the ceiling, and struck the leader down by hurling stones like thunderbolts. They then cut him into pieces and threw his head to those who were waiting outside. Blessed in all things be our God, who has delivered the sacrilegious over to death. As we shall be celebrating the purification of the temple on the 25th of Chislev, we consider it proper to notify you, so that you too may celebrate it, as you do the Feast of Shelters and the fire that appeared, when Nehemiah, the builder of the temple and the altar, offered sacrifice. For when our ancestors were being deported to Persia, the devout priest of the time took some of the fire from the altar and hid it secretly in a hole like a dry well, where they concealed it in such a way that the place was unknown to anyone. When some years had elapsed, in God's good time, Nehemiah, commissioned by the king of Persia, sent the descendants of the priest who had hidden the fire to look for it. When they reported that in fact they had found not fire but a thick liquid, Nehemiah ordered them to draw some out and bring it back. When they had done this, Nehemiah ordered the priests to pour this liquid over the sacrificial materials, that is, the wood and what lay on it. When this had been done, and when in due course the sun, which had previously been clouded over, shone out, a great fire flamed up to the astonishment of all. While the sacrifice was being burned, the priest offered prayer, Jonathan intoning with all the priests, and the rest responding with Nehemiah. The prayer took this form: Lord, Lord, God, creator of all things, awesome, strong, just, merciful, the only king and benefactor, the only provider, who alone are just, almighty, and everlasting, the deliverer of Israel from every evil, who made our fathers your chosen ones and sanctified them. Accept this sacrifice on behalf of all your people of Israel. Our people Israel, not people of Israel. And protect your heritage and consecrate it. Bring together those of us who are dispersed. Set free those in slavery among the heathen. Look favorably on those held in contempt or abhorrence, and let the heathen know that you are our God. Punish those who oppress us and affront us by their insolence, and plant your people firmly in your holy place, as Moses promised. The priest then chanted hymns, accompanied by the harp. When the sacrifice had been burnt, Nehemiah ordered the remaining liquid to be poured over large stones, and when this was done, a flame flared up, to be absorbed in a corresponding blaze of light from the altar. When the matter became known, and the king of the Persians heard that, in the place where the exiled priest had hidden the fire, a liquid had appeared, with which Nehemiah and his people had purified the sacrificial offerings. The king, after verifying the facts, had the place enclosed and pronounced sacred. To the people on whom the king bestowed it, he granted a part of the considerable revenue he derived from it. Nehemiah and his people termed this stuff nephtar, which means purification, but it is commonly called nephtah. Chapter 2. Jeremiah conceals the tent, ark, and altar. It is on record that the prophet Jeremiah ordered the deportees to take the fire, as we have described, and how, having given them the law, the prophet warned the deportees never to forget the Lord's precepts, nor to let their thoughts be tempted by the sight of gold and silver statues or the finery adorning them. Among other similar admonitions, he urged them not to let the law depart from their hearts. The same document also describes how the prophet, warned by an oracle, gave orders for the tent and the ark to go with him when he set out for the mountain which Moses had climbed to survey God's heritage. On his arrival, Jeremiah found a cave dwelling, into which he put the tent, the ark, and the altar of incense, afterwards blocking up the entrance. Some of his companions went back later to mark out the path, but were unable to find it. When Jeremiah learned this, he reproached them. The place is to remain unknown, he said, until God gathers his people together again and shows them his mercy. Then the Lord will bring these things once more to light, and the glory of the Lord will be seen, and so will the cloud, as it was revealed in the time of Moses, and when Solomon prayed that the holy place might be gloriously hallowed. It was also recorded how Solomon in his wisdom offered the sacrifice of the dedication and completion of the sanctuary. As Moses had prayed to the Lord, and fire had come down from heaven and burned up the sacrifice, so Solomon also prayed, and the fire from above consumed the burnt offerings. Moses had said, because the sacrifice for sin had not been eaten, it was burnt instead. Solomon similarly observed the 8-day festival. Nehemiah's library. In addition to the above, it was also recorded both in these writings and in the memoirs of Nehemiah, how Nehemiah founded a library and made a collection of the books dealing with the kings and the prophets, the writings of David, and the letters of the kings on the subject of offerings. Similarly, Judas made a complete collection of the books dispersed in the late war. And these we still have. If you need any of them, send someone to fetch them. Now we're reading about an invitation to the dedication. Since we are about to celebrate the purification, we now write, requesting you to observe the same days. God, who has saved his whole people, conferring heritage, kingdom, priesthood, and sanctification on all of us, as he has promised in the law, will surely, as our hope is in him, be swift to show us mercy and gather us together from everywhere under heaven to the holy place, since he has rescued us from great evils and has purified it. The story of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, the purification of the great temple, the dedication of the altar, together with the wars against Antiochus, Epiphanes, and his son, Eupator, and then celestial manifestations that came to hearten the brave champions of Judaism, so that few though they were, they pillaged the whole country, routed the barbarian hordes, recovered the sanctuary, renowned the whole world over, liberated the city and reestablished the laws by then all but abolished, the Lord showing his favor by all his gracious help to them. All this already related in 5 books by Jason of Cyrene. We shall attempt to condense into a single work, considering the spate of figures and the difficulty encountered because of the mass of material by those who wish to immerse themselves in historical records. We have aimed at providing diversion for those who merely want something to read, a saving of labor for those who enjoy committing things to memory, and profit for each and all. For us who have undertaken the drudgery of this abridgment, it has been no easy task, but a matter of sweat and midnight oil, compared to the exacting task of someone organizing a banquet, whose aim is to satisfy a variety of taste. Nevertheless, for the sake of rendering a general service, we remain glad to endure this drudgery, leaving accuracy of detail to the historian and concentrating our effort on tracing the outlines in this condensed version. Just as the architect of a new house is responsible for the construction as a whole, while the man undertaking the ceramic painting has to take into consideration only the decorative requirements, so I think it is with us. To make the subject his own, to explore its byways, to be meticulous about details, is the business of the original historian. But the person making the adaptation must be allowed to aim at conciseness of expression and to forego any exhaustive treatment of his subject. So now let us begin our narrative without adding any more to what has been said above. There would be no sense in expanding the preface to the history and curtailing the history itself. This is the arrival of Heliodorus in Jerusalem. Chapter 3. while the holy city was inhabited in all peace and the laws were observed as perfectly as possible, owing to the piety of Onias, the high priest, and his hatred of wickedness, it came about that the kings themselves honored the holy place and enhanced the glory of the temple with the most splendid offerings, even to the extent that Seleucus, king of Asia, defrayed from his own revenues all the expenses arising out of the sacrificial liturgy. But a certain Simon of the tribe of Bilgah, on being appointed administrator of the temple, came into conflict with the high priest over the regulation of the city markets. Unable to get the better of Onias, he went off to Apollonius, son of Thrasois, who was at that time commander-in-chief of Syria and Phoenicia, and made out to him that the treasury in Jerusalem was groaning with untold wealth, that the amount contributed was incalculable, and out of all proportion to expenditure on the sacrifice, but that it could all be brought under the control of the king. Apollonius met the king and told him about the wealth that had been disclosed to him, whereupon the king selected Heliodorus, his chancellor, and sent him with instructions to effect the removal of the reported wealth. Heliodorus lost no time in setting out to inspect the towns of Syria and Phoenicia, but in fact to accomplish the king's purpose. On his arrival in Jerusalem, and after a hospitable reception from the high priest and the city, he announced what had been disclosed, thus revealing the reason for his presence, and asked if this was indeed the true situation. The high priest explained that there were funds set aside for widows and orphans, with some belonging to Hyrcanus, son of Tobias, a man occupying a very exalted position, and that the whole sum, in contrast to what the evil Simon had alleged, amounted to 400 talents of silver and 200 of gold. He also added that it was entirely out of the question that an injustice should be done to those who had put their trust in the sanctity of the place and in the inviolable majesty of a temple venerated throughout the entire world. But Heliodorus, because of his instructions from the king, insisted that the funds must be confiscated for the royal exchequer. Fixing a day for the purpose, he went in to draw up an inventory of the funds. There was no little consternation throughout the city. The priests in their sacred vestments prostrated themselves before the altar and prayed to heaven, to the author of the law governing deposits, to preserve these funds intact for the depositors. The appearance of the high priest was enough to pierce the hearts of the beholder, his expression and his altered color betraying the anguish of his soul. The man was so overwhelmed by fear and bodily trembling that those who saw him could not possibly mistake the distress he was suffering. People rushed headlong from the houses, intent on making public supplication because of the indignity threatening the holy place. Women thronged the streets, swathed in sackcloth below their breast. Girls secluded indoors came running, some to the doorways, some to the city walls, while others leaned out the windows, all stretching out their hands to heaven in entreaty. It was pitiful to see the people crowding together to prostrate themselves, and the foreboding of the high priest in his deep anguish. while they were calling on all-powerful Lord to preserve the deposits intact for the depositors in full security, Heliodorus set about his appointed task. He had already arrived with his bodyguard near the treasury, when the sovereign of spirits and of every power caused so great an apparition that all who had declared or dared to accompany Heliodorus were dumbfounded at the power of God and reduced to abject terror. Before their eyes appeared a horse richly caparisoned and carrying a fearsome rider. Rearing violently, it struck at Heliodorus with its forefeet. The rider was seen to be accoutred entirely in gold. Two other young men of outstanding strength and radiant beauty, magnificently apparelled, appeared to him at the same time, and, taking their stand on each side of him, flogged him, unremittingly, inflicting stroke after stroke. Suddenly, Heliodorus fell to the ground, enveloped in thick darkness. His men came to his rescue and placed him in a litter. This man, who but a moment before had made his way into the treasury, and we said, as we said above, with a great retinue and his whole bodyguard. And as they carried him away, powerless to help himself, they openly acknowledged the sovereign power of God. While Heliodorus lay prostrate under the divine visitation, speechless and bereft of all hope of deliverance, the Jews blessed the Lord, who had miraculously glorified his own holy place. And the temple, which a little while before had been filled with terror and commotion, now overflowed with joy and gladness at the manifestation of the Almighty Lord. Some of Heliodorus' companions quickly begged Onias to entreat the Most High to grant the man his life, lying as he did at the very point of death. The high priest, afraid that the king might suspect the Jews of some foul play concerning Heliodorus, did indeed offer a sacrifice for the man's recovery. And while the high priest was performing the rite of expiation, the same young men again appeared to Heliodorus, wearing the same apparel, and, standing beside him, said, "Be very grateful to Onias the high priest, since it is for his sake that the Lord has granted you your life. As for you, who have been scourged by heaven, you must proclaim to everyone the grandeur of God's power." So saying, they vanished. Heliodorus offered sacrifice to the Lord, and made most solemn vows to the preserver of his life, and then took courteous leave of Onias, and marched his forces back to the king. He openly testified to everyone about the works of the supreme God, which he had seen with his own eyes. When the king asked Heliodorus what sort of man would be the right person to send to Jerusalem on a second occasion, he replied, "If you have some enemy or anyone disloyal to the state, send him there, and you will get him back well flogged, if he survives at all, since some peculiarly divine power attaches to the holy place. He who has his dwelling in heaven watches over the place and defends it, and he strikes down and destroys those who come to harm it." This was the outcome of the affair of Heliodorus and the preservation of the treasury. Chapter 4. The misdeeds of Simon, administrator of the temple. The Simon mentioned above as the informer against the funds and against his country began slandering Onias. insinuating that the latter had been responsible for the assault on Heliodorus, and himself had contrived this misfortune. Simon now had the effrontery to name this benefactor of the city, this protector of his compatriots, this zealot for the Jews, as an enemy of the public good. This hostility reached such proportions that murders were actually committed by some of Simon's agents, and at this point, Onias, recognizing how mischievous this rivalry was, and aware that Apollonius, son of Menesthius, the general commanding Chios Syria and Phoenicia, was encouraging Simon in his malice, went to see the king, not to play the accuser of his fellow citizens, but having the public and private welfare of the entire people at heart. He saw that without some intervention by the king, an orderly administration would no longer be possible, nor would Simon put a stop to his folly. When Seleucus had departed this life, and Antiochus, styled Epiphanes, had succeeded to the kingdom, Jason, brother of Onias, usurped the high priesthood. He approached the king with a promise of 360 talents of silver, with 80 talents to come from some other source of revenue. He further committed himself to paying another 150 if the king would empower him to set up a gymnasium and youth center, and to register the Antiochus of Jerusalem. When the king gave his assent, Jason, as soon as he had seized power, imposed the Greek way of life on his fellow countrymen. He suppressed the liberties which the king had graciously granted to the Jews, at the instance of John, father of the Eupolemus, who was later to be sent on an embassy to negotiate a treaty of friendship and alliance with the Romans, and, overthrowing the lawful institutions, introduced new usages contrary to the law. He went so far as to found a gymnasium at the very foot of the citadel, and to fit out the noblest of his young men in the pedessos, godless wretch that he was, and no true high priest. Jason set no bounds to his impiety. Indeed, the Hellenising process reached such a pitch that the priest ceased to show any interest in serving the altar, but scorning the temple and neglecting the sacrifices, they would hurry, on the stroke of the gong, to take part in the distribution, forbidden by the law, of the oil on the exercise ground, setting no store by the honors of their fatherland. They esteemed Hellenic glories best of all. But all this brought its own retribution. The very people whose way of life they envied, whom they sought to resemble in everything, proved to be their enemies and executioners. It is no small thing to violate the divine laws, as the period that followed will demonstrate. On the occasion of these games at Tyre, in the presence of the king, the vile Jason sent an embassy of Antiochus from Jerusalem, taking with them 300 silver drachmas for the sacrifice to Hercules. But even those who brought the money did not think it would be right to spend it on the sacrifice, and decided to reserve it for some other item of expenditure. And so what the sender had intended for the sacrifice to Hercules was in fact applied, at the suggestion of those who brought it, to the construction of Trimes. Apollonius, son of Menesthius, had been sent to Egypt to attend the wedding of King Philometor. Antiochus, having learnt that the latter had become hostile to his affairs, began thinking about his own safety. That was why he had come to Joppa. He then moved to Jerusalem, where he was given a magnificent welcome by Jason and the city, and escorted in by torchlight with acclamation, after which he marched his army into Phoenicia. When 3 years had passed, Jason sent Menelaus, brother of the Simon mentioned above, to convey the money to the king and to complete negotiations on various essential matters. But Menelaus, on being presented to the king, flattered him by his own appearance of authority, and so secured the high priesthood for himself, outbidding Jason by 300 talents of silver. He returned with the royal mandate, bringing nothing worthy of the high priesthood, and supported only by the fury of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage beast. Thus Jason, who had supplanted his own brother, was in turn supplanted by a third, and obliged to take refuge in Ammoniotus. As for Menelaus, he secured the office, but defaulted altogether on the sums promised to the king. Although Sostratus, the commandant of the citadel, whose business it was to collect the revenue, kept demanding payment, the pair of them, in consequence, were summoned before the king. Menelaus, leaving his brother Lysimachus as deputy high priest, while Sostratus left Crates, the commander of the Cypriots, to act for him. The murder of Onias. While all this was going on, it happened that the people of Tarsus and Malice revolted, because their towns had been given as a present to Antiochus, the king's concubine. The king therefore hurried off to settle the affair, leaving Andronicus, one of his dignitaries, to act as his deputy. Thinking he had found a favorable opportunity, Menelaus abstracted a number of golden vessels from the temple and presented them to Andronicus, and managed to sell others to Tyre and the surrounding cities. On receiving clear evidence to this effect, Onias retired to a place of sanctuary at Daphne near Antioch, and then taxed him with it. Menelaus then had a quiet word with Andronicus, urging him to get rid of Onias. Andronicus sought out Onias, and resorting to the trick of offending him, his right hand on oath, succeeded in persuading him, despite the latter's lingering suspicions, to leave sanctuary. Whereupon, in defiance of all justice, he immediately put him to death. The result was that not only Jews, but many people of other nationalities were appalled and outraged by the unjust murder of this man. On the king's return from the region of Cilicia, the Jews of the capital and those Greeks who shared their hatred of the crime appealed to him about the unjustified murder of Onias. Antiochus was profoundly grieved and filled with pity, and he wept for the prudence and moderation of the dead man. Burning with indignation, he immediately stripped Andronicus of the purple, tore his garments off him, and parading him through the length of the city, rid the world of the assassination on the very spot where he had laid impious hands on Onias, the Lord dealing out to him the punishment he deserved. Now, Lysimachus, with the connivance of Menelaus, had committed many sacrilegious thefts in the city, and when the facts became widely known, the populace rose against Lysimachus, who had already disposed of many pieces of gold plate. The infuriated mob was becoming menacing, and Lysimachus armed nearly 3,000 men and took aggressive action. The troops were led by a certain Onias, a man advanced in years and no less in folly. Recognizing this act of aggression as the work of Lysimachus, some snatched up stones, others cudgels, while others scooped up handfuls of ashes lying at hand, and all hurled everything indiscriminately at Lysimachus' men, to such effect that they wounded many of them, even killing a few, and routed them all. The sacrilegious thief himself they killed near the treasury. As a result of this, legal proceedings were taken against Menelaus. When the king came down to Tyre, 3 men, deputed by the Senate, pleaded their case before him. Menelaus, seeing the case had gone against him, promised a substantial sum to Ptolemy, son of Dormenes, if he would influence the king in his favor. Ptolemy then took the king aside into a colonnade, as though for a breath of fresh air, and persuaded him to change his mind. The king then dismissed the charges against Menelaus, the cause of all this evil, while he condemned to death the other poor wretches who, had they pleaded even before Scythians, would have been let off scot-free. No time was lost in carrying out this unjust punishment on those who had championed the cause of the city, the townships, and the sacred vessels. Some Tyrians even were so outraged by the crime that they provided sumptuously for their funeral, while as a result of the greed of the powerful, Menelaus remained in power, growing more wicked than ever, and establishing himself as the chief enemy of his fellow citizens. Chapter 5. Second Egyptian Campaign. At about this time, Antiochus was preparing for his second attack on Egypt. It then happened that all over the city for nearly 40 days there were apparitions of horsemen galloping through the air in cloth and gold, troops of lancers fully armed, squadrons of cavalry in order of battle, attacks and charges this way and that, a flourish of shields, a forest of pikes, a brandishing of swords, a hurling of missiles, a glittering of golden accoutrements, or accoutrements, and armor of all kinds. So everyone prayed that this manifestation might prove a good omen. Jason's insurrection, counteraction by Antiochus Epiphanes. Then on the strength of a false report that Antiochus was dead, Jason took at least 1,000 men and launched an unexpected attack on the city. When the walls had been breached and the city was finally on the point of being taken, Menelaus took refuge in the citadel. Jason, however, made a pitiless slaughter of his fellow citizens, oblivious of the fact that success against his own countrymen was the greatest of disasters, but rather picturing himself as winning trophies from some enemy, and not from his fellow countrymen. Even so, he did not manage to seize power, and in the end, his machinations brought him nothing but shame. And he took refuge once more in Antiochus. His career of wickedness was thus brought to a halt. Imprisoned by Heliodorus, the Arab despot, escaping from his town, hunted by everyone, detested for having overthrown the laws, abhorred as the butcher of his country and his countrymen, he drifted to Egypt. He who had exiled so many from their fatherland himself perished on foreign soil, having traveled to Sparta, hoping that for kinship's sake he might find harbor there. So many carcasses he had thrust out to lie unburied. Now he himself had none to mourn him. No funeral rites, no place in the tomb of his ancestors. When the king came to hear of what had happened, he concluded that Judea was in revolt. He therefore marched from Egypt, raging like a wild beast, and began by storming the city. He then ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy everyone that encountered, and to butcher all who took refuge in their houses. It was a massacre of young and old, a slaughter of women and children, a butchery of young girls and infants. There were 80,000 victims in the course of those 3 days, 40,000 dying by violence, and as many again being sold into slavery. Pillage of the temple. Not content with this, he had the audacity to enter the holiest temple in the entire world with Menelaus, the traitor to the laws and to his country, as his guide. With impure hands he seized the sacred vessels. With impious hands he seized the offerings presented by other kings for the aggrandizement, glory, and dignity of the holy place. Holding so high an opinion of himself, Antiochus did not realize that the Lord was temporarily angry at the sins of the inhabitants of the city. Hence his unconcern for the holy place. Had they not been entangled in many sins? Antiochus too, like Heliodorus, when King Seleucus sent him to inspect the treasury, would have been flogged the moment he arrived and checked in his presumption. The Lord, however, had not chosen the people for the sake of the holy place, but the holy place for the sake of the people. And so the holy place itself, having shared the disasters that befell the people, in due course also shared their good fortune, having been abandoned by the Almighty in his anger. Once the great sovereign was placated, it was reinstated in all its glory. Antiochus, having extracted 1,800 talents from the temple, hurried back to Antioch. In his pride he would have undertaken to make the dry land navigable, and the sea passable on foot. So high his arrogance soared. But he left officials behind to plague the nation. In Jerusalem, Philip, a Phrygian by race, and by nature more barbarous than the man who appointed him, on Mount Gerizim, Andronicus, and besides these, Menelaus, who lorded it over his countrymen worse than all the others. In his rooted hostility to the Jews, the king also sent the Misarch Apollonius at the head of an army 22,000 strong, with orders to put to death all men in their prime and to sell the women and children. Arriving in Jerusalem and posing as a man of peace, this man waited until the holy day of the Sabbath, and then, taking advantage of the Jews as they rested from work, ordered his men to parade fully armed. All those who came out to watch he put to the sword. Then, rushing into the city with his armed troops, he cut down an immense number of people. Judas, also known as Maccabees, however, with about 9 others, withdrew into the desert. He lived like wild animals in the hills, with his companions, eating nothing but wild plants to avoid contracting defilement.